All righty. Well, my clock and my phone both say it's 12 o'clock and I feel like I don't have an extra minute to spare during this time. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone. Today we are going to be talking about I can't say everything you need to know as a public agency representative because these are things that you learn over the years and there's always something new around the corner that you have to flex and learn more for, but we're going to cover at least the basics of what every public agency representative needs to know. Just a couple of housekeeping items first. This is in webinar mode, which means all of your cameras are automatically off and all of the microphones are disabled. I would encourage you, there are a couple of times that we're going to be doing some things in the chat, but if at any time you have questions, pop them into the chat rather than using the Q&A button, only because I can only manage watching so many screens at once and I don't want to miss anything. So feel free to drop in questions anytime you have them and we'll try to make sure that we get everything covered. My name is Angie McKinney and I'm one of the consultants with the Indiana IEP Resource Center. I am a psychologist by background, but also have been a special education administrator for several years as well, and served as the public agency representative in a lot of case conferences. So I want to make sure that that we share some things that are things you're going to need to know from day one. Also some things that you're going to want to share with other people who are serving within this role. But we're going to cover quite a few different topics. So you should have all gotten an email ahead of time that said that there was some pre-work, some homework, which we know we don't like homework, but again, I wanted to make sure that you had access to some resources and had a little bit of background first. If you didn't watch the videos that I sent to you, then you're going to be fine for today as well. So we will go over some of the information from the video resources, but there's also some information that we just don't have time to cover. But those videos are very short and are easy ways for you to go back to the Padlet at any time and get some clarification on some of those topics. So I sent you three specifically to look at, one on exactly what is a public agency representative and what the qualifications and the responsibilities are. We're going to cover everything from that video today. There's also one on members of the case conference committee. Who needs to be there? Who is required? How do you formally and legally excuse somebody when you need to? All of the details around that. We won't be covering most of that today. So again, make sure you go back and watch that video when you get a chance. And then also there's a short video on the notice of procedural safeguards. Now we will talk about this a little bit today, but it goes over all of the times and the situations where you are legally required to provide the notice of procedural safeguards. One of them that we're going to hit very hard today is within the context of manifestation determinations. This is a time that sometimes administrators in particular tend to get kind of caught up in all of the things surrounding a disciplinary action and forget to send out this notice. So we'll cover that as well. We're going to talk a little bit about key ways to support case conference meetings. So in your role as a public agency representative at a meeting, what are some things that you can do to make those meetings go smoother? And then finally, we'll wrap up this session today with some just general tips for keeping your district in compliance. So I can look through the list here and see who's here, and we've got a lot of people on here that I know have years and years of experience. So again, anything that you can add in the chat, I'm sure it will be to the benefit of other people who are participating as well. So this is the link to the Padlet, and again, you would have gotten this in your email. Make sure that you bookmark this somewhere. I frequently add new resources or pieces of information into this Padlet, and hopefully it will be a place that is permanent, that you can find these resources whenever you need them. So just check it out and explore it whenever you have a chance. Beyond some of the things that we're going to talk about during today's training, there are some resources on there that could be very helpful to not only you, but to some of your teachers, some of your multidisciplinary teams. So just look through the resources, and always feel free to reach out to anyone here at the Indiana IEP Resource Center with any questions or if you need additional support. All right, so let's get started with exactly what is a PAR. And this term is kind of, I wouldn't say it's an Indiana term, but in different states, you will hear different terminology used to talk about this role. We use public agency representative in Article 7. So that is the term that they use, but I've been in places where we talked about the building rep, the LEA rep. There are several different kinds of terms that are used. But this is talking about a specific role within the case conference meeting. And the public agency representative is one of the roles that is required no matter what type of case conference you're having, no matter what the purpose is. There is always a requirement for somebody to be in this role. So this is exactly what Article 7 says. And this is copy pasted pretty much directly from Article 7. So every meeting has got to have a person in this role who meets these different criteria. So number one, you have to be knowledgeable about the availability of and have the authority to commit the resources of the public agency, which means not necessarily just your building. The public agency is really talking about your LEA as a whole. Knowing what resources are there that we can say, absolutely, we can do that in an IEP. And you have to have the authority to say, we can and will do that once we write it in the IEP. So, I mean, this really is an important role, not just to make some general decisions, but be able to stand by them, which means you can't just put anybody in that role. It's got to be somebody who has a good understanding of what's going on and is saying, we're going to stand behind this IEP. That person also has to either be qualified to provide specially designed instruction or special education, or to supervise the provision of specially designed instruction in order to meet the unique needs of a student with a disability, which means you got to either have special ed background or like administrative background where you are qualified to supervise what's going on. And then finally, that person also needs to be knowledgeable about the general education curriculum, because we know that all of our students with disabilities are first and foremost students that are gen ed students. And everything that we do is designed to try and help them make progress in the general ed curriculum. So that means that we don't just need to know about special education. We need to know about what happens out there in the general ed curriculum, so that we can make sure that what we design for students is going to align with that. Now, in general, we've got most people who are in an administrative role that are going to meet this criteria, but not always, right? So our building administrators should be able to supervise. They should know what's going on. They should have the authority to be able to commit resources. They should be knowledgeable about the general education curriculum. Most building administrators are going to meet this role, or meet the criteria to serve in this role. The same with most district administrators. Now, your special ed directors, absolutely. I mean, I don't know a special ed administrator that would not meet the criteria. However, I have I have encountered some district administrators who don't have an education background, particularly in a superintendent's role. Now, a lot of superintendents, of course, do have a solid educational background, but some have come from very different kind of backgrounds and maybe don't meet all three criteria of really having a good understanding there. So it's important that you're always looking at, do you meet the criteria? Don't care what your title is necessarily, but do you meet all three of those criteria? And then there is the provision for having a designee of a person, but your designee has to meet those criteria as well, which means if I'm the principal of my building and I have somebody else who's going to sit in that position to be the public agency representative for a meeting, I need to make sure that I am only allowing someone to go in who I have given the authority to commit resources, who has a good understanding of those resources, who can provide or supervise specially designed instruction, and who also has knowledge of the general ed curriculum. So really think about, can I stand behind the person that I might designate to be in that role to make those kind of decisions? I know, and this may kind of hit a sore spot for some people out there today. But because of limited ability to have meetings, limited coverage for classes and everything else, there are a lot of districts who have allowed their speech pathologists to serve as their own public agency representative for their meetings, to serve both as the teacher of record and also as the public agency representative. But really think about, do your speech pathologists, do your teachers of record, do your, some of the other people that sit in on those roles, do they meet all three of those criteria? Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they know what's maybe going on within their scope, but not necessarily beyond that or in another building, to really have a good understanding of what those resources are. So be very cautious about designating beyond the typical roles to serve in that position. Okay, so as a public agency representative, and remembering that you are a required role at every case conference that there is, your role can really be helpful in making sure the meeting goes smoothly. Now, there are different activities that are happening during the meetings. There's activities related to the content, knowing the student, designing the goals, gathering information. There are also things related to the meeting process. And the meeting process is often where things can go terribly wrong. Discussions not including everyone, things not getting documented the way they need to. There are a lot of different things that can happen related to personalities, emotions, clarity, all sorts of things. And one of the things that a public agency representative can do that can be really helpful is to manage the process. So not complete the paperwork related to an IEP, but to manage the meeting process so that the teacher of record can really dig into the content and develop the IEP with the case conference committee. So here's some things that you can do. And we have a good half-day training on effective case conferences that we provide. And this is kind of a shortened version of that, just to give you some of the high points. So I want to look first at some of the things that can be an issue that can lead to negative meetings. And then we'll talk about some activities that you can do prior to the meeting even starting to help them go smoothly, or to encourage your teacher to do as well. And then some things that can happen during the meeting as well as kind of some follow-up things that can help make your meetings, again, go smoothly and promote that really positive relationship. That relationship with our parents, relationships within the building on how we approach special education, can really make or break the situation. And for some of you, you have families that you are going to have for years and years and years to come. And so a good positive relationship is going to carry you through so many years. All right, so let's start with some of the issues. Now, I want to say that our office for years now has done facilitated IEP meetings. And in the process, we've seen some beautiful meetings. We've seen schools who have done some things that I instantly think, oh my gosh, I want to make sure that the next meeting I go to, they do that as well, because they really have been very positive. But then we've also seen some things that are very, like, we know why there's a problem, right? Some things that have happened during meetings that we're like, oh my goodness, no wonder there's so much tension. And a lot of it centers around these 5 areas. The big one being communication. How we communicate with each other, when we communicate, how early we communicate on issues, lots of different things related to communication. Some of it is also related to being prepared for the meetings, having the space ready, having the paperwork ready, having your notice of procedural safeguards ready, just having all of our ducks in a row. If you really think about every single IEP meeting that we have as being a marketing opportunity for your building, to say, we are the people who are educating your child, and we are a great place. You want to send your kid to us. You want to entrust us with your students' education. Every single meeting is about showing we've got it together, whether we do or not, because some days I have it together, some days I don't. But it really is a way for you to market yourself as a great resource for this family and this child. Sometimes there are issues related to clarity, just things being kind of fuzzy in the IEP or fuzzy in our conversation during the case conference. Lots of issues related to respect or perceived respect or disrespect. Body language, how we address each other, how we treat people at meetings. And then finally, just transparency. Really being above board, having all of our cards on the table, not holding back anything, not having hidden agendas, things like that. Okay, so we'll jump into the how do you do this stuff? How do you make it better? So we're going to start with things that you could do before the meeting. And number 1 is, we know, based on the law, based on both Article 7 and what's in the IDEA, we have to have our meetings at a mutually agreed upon time and place. I think that's getting easier with us getting used to having that opportunity to do virtual meetings when needed. I think we're getting more parents to participate in meetings, and I think this is getting to be more commonplace. But the big thing is we have to look at that mutually agreed upon, which means just because a parent says I can only meet on Saturday mornings doesn't mean we need a Saturday morning meeting. But on the flip side of that, just because the 3rd grade teachers have their prep time from 2 to 3 does not mean that that's the only opportunity for us to have a meeting. And sometimes we try to limit those, we can only have meetings on certain days or at certain times. It just means we've got to work together on both the time and the place, the date, all that kind of stuff. So the best thing to do is back that up as much as we can. Try to plan ahead. If I know I've got a meeting that's going to have to be held by mid-October, I'm probably going to reach out to the parent starting in early September and say, look, this is our date. What are some good dates for you? And we'll try to see if we can get that together. So always start with the parent. and then back that up to the school. So the more advance notice that we have, the more likely that the parent is going to be able to get off for a few hours from work, find childcare if they need it, any of those things that tend to get in the way of parents participating. And we've got to have parents participate. If you don't have a parent there, it just was not your best meeting. I mean, it doesn't mean that we can't hold meetings without parents when a parent just absolutely can't come, but they're better when we have parent involvement. Absolutely. We also have to make sure that we put it in writing. Now, the law requires, as part of prior written notice for meetings, for us to include a bunch of stuff. There's a lot of legal stuff that is required. So we always start by either calling, emailing, texting, whatever we do to get in touch with the parent to say, need to schedule a meeting, what kind of availability do you have? But we also have to put it on the formal written notice, the notice of conference that comes from the IEP system, because that documentation is what includes all the legal requirements. If we don't have that and we're just doing it through phone calls and calendar invites and things like that, we still may get a parent there, but we've not fulfilled the legal requirement to have the prior written notice for that meeting. So make sure that your teachers are doing that. As a psychologist, I know I've attended a lot of meetings where the first time that the notice was printed was the morning of the conference to bring in and have a parent sign that they are coming, which means I'm already sitting here, right? That's not prior written notice. And just make sure and remind your teachers, this needs to go out ahead of time. There is no specific date of how many days in advance. A lot of people do have this as part of their district policies and procedures, which is great. I've heard a lot of people say, 10 school days prior to a meeting, we need to have this written notice out. That's great if you want to put that in. It just says, I'm not sure exactly what the term is, but appropriate notice or, adequate notice, I believe is what it says. So, no specific deadline for that. Just make sure we get that out ahead of time. Again, we have to make sure all the people are there sitting around the table, right? Go back to that Padlet video anytime that you need to say, okay, who are the people that need to be here, so that you make sure that, number one, you have the people there that are required, but you also, for someone who you're going to formally excuse, if the parent will agree to that you do it right. And again, we don't really have time to dig into that too much, but you can get all of that from that Padlet video, and all of those videos are super short. Train your staff who are coming to those meetings why they're there. A lot of times gen ed teachers have never really been told why they need to come to these meetings, or what their purpose is during that time. And when they don't, if I don't know why I'm coming to a meeting, I'm not real invested in the meeting. I may sit in a staff meeting that I'm not sure exactly why I'm there, thinking, okay, I've got a lot of things I could be doing right now. I've got students in the classroom. I've got all this stuff going on. If we can train staff on what it is that you bring to the table, then they're going to be more engaged. They're going to come more prepared. Make sure that they know this student too. I actually went to an IEP meeting one time where the gen ed student came in and sat down next to the parent and said, "Now, I don't know who your daughter is. Tell me what she looks like." That's not the way to start a meeting, definitely. So make sure that they really have a good understanding. And here's what you can tell the gen ed teacher, because that, again, tends to be the person who is not really sure why they're at a special education meeting. Well, number one, we know that all students are gen ed students first, which means the gen ed teacher is incredibly valuable at the table. They are the person who knows the gen ed curriculum. They know the grade level standards. And most of our special educators will know some of the standards for multiple grade levels, but they don't know those fourth grade standards inside and out like a fourth grade teacher would. So we need to make sure that they have a good understanding of why they're there. They also will have, if the student is coming into their classroom, which most students with IEPs will be in the gen ed classroom for at least part of the day, they should have some observations on what do I see academically and behaviorally in my class. They can provide feedback on we know that they should have a list of the accommodations and modifications that they are supposed to implement, but they can tell us, how is it going, right? Does the student fight them every time that they want to read a test to them and say, I don't need it, I don't want it? That's important for the case conference committee to know. They can also tell us more about things that they're doing that maybe aren't on the IEP, but should be, right? That would be helpful to add into the IEP. Another really big thing is they are the comparison factor. A lot of times, when we work in the world of special education exclusively, we know how students are making progress on their goals. We know how far they've come. We know how they are compared to other kids with disabilities. But it's important to have a comparison to how are non-disabled students doing. So if we can say, yes, the student is making leaps and bounds of growth in reading, and we've made all this progress. But now let me tell you what other fourth grade students are doing and how it's different. I think it's really important for parents to have a good understanding of how far do we have yet to go, so that they're not misled. You don't want to come across a parent who is entering high school with their child and their student has been making A's for years and years and years, but yet the student is so far below grade level. They sometimes don't understand that piece. Make sure that your gen ed teachers bring data to the meetings. They should have all this data on how students are doing. Are we turning things in? When we are, how is that compared to tests versus homework versus in-class assignments? They're going to have data, and their data is incredibly important. All right, so make sure that if you have to have an excusal, you follow the procedures, but don't be so quick to ask for that excusal. Again, our gen ed teachers are incredibly important during this meeting. But when we do excuse, if you are a required member, you've got to have a written excusal from the parent, and that is supposed to be prior to the meeting, which is why we send home that notice of conference that says we anticipate this person may need to leave or this person can't be there at all, and we're asking for their written permission to make that happen. Now, you can also let the parents know if somebody who is not required is going to be meeting, but you technically do not have to. It's just more of a courtesy to say, our guidance counselor is going to be attending. That person is not a required member. However, she's going to pop in, give some information, and then she has to get back to something else, right? Another piece that is a requirement, if I'm going to leave and I'm a required member, or if I'm not going to be there at all, unless I have attended the part of the meeting where I've given my input into the development of the IEP, it's required that I provide written input to both the parent and the rest of the case conference committee prior to the meeting. And that's something that I think gets overlooked a lot out there. But if you can develop just a written input form that includes some basic things. I put a form on the Padlet that could be something that's used, but you can develop your own in-house as well. But you want to have some kind of formalized procedure to make that happen. You also may have a lot of other people there. Think about, are you gonna need more space? Are you gonna need a longer period of time? There could be a lot of things that this affects. Make sure and most of you probably already do, if a parent brings an attorney and you did not know in advance, the most common thing, and I've never seen anybody not do this, is for that meeting to be shut down and rescheduled when your school's attorney can be there as well. Parents are entitled to bring anyone they want, and they don't have to tell you. But I encourage them to tell the schools, because it really does affect the space, or it affects maybe who the school needs to bring. The parent gets to decide if the person they're bringing has knowledge and expertise about the child. In the same way, if as the school, you have someone on staff who you believe needs to be there that has expertise and knowledge about the child, then that is for the school to decide. The difference is, we as the school have to put it on the notice of conference to say we are inviting this person. Which means if, sometimes you come across those situations where a parent says, I don't want this person there. I don't want the dean of students there. Sometimes that happens when a student's been in a lot of disciplinary trouble. But the school actually gets to decide who on their staff is appropriate to fill those different roles and to be part of it. Sometimes it's not worth the battle. Sometimes you know that bringing a certain person to a meeting might actually cause more harm than good. And you may just want to get some written input from that person. Sometimes that's the best choice you can make too. But ultimately, it's for the school to decide who on their staff is appropriate, and for the parent to decide if they want to bring somebody else. It's always important to let parents know, though, that we're not going to vote on anything ever. So it's not a matter of loading up the team for a vote. Because I think sometimes parents are misled, and they think that I need to have a lot of people here so that my voice is louder, my voice counts more. Make sure you prepare the space. And again, this should be kind of a no-brainer, but sometimes we're really cluttered in a space, or we have a space that's just not appropriate for a meeting. So think about the different factors related to an appropriate meeting space. Getting prepared. Oh my. Sometimes when we have a lot of stuff to consider, if we don't prep it in advance, it will eat up so much meeting time. Meaning, if we get an outside report, we have to consider it. But that doesn't mean we need to take the meeting time to all sit through and read it word for word. It would be more helpful if somebody could summarize it into bullet points ahead of time to cut down that time. Or if you've got, 3 months worth of behavior data and daily behavior charts, don't bring in a stack. Summarize those into a graph or a chart that shows how things are going. It will be so much easier for both the parent and the rest of your case conference committee to digest. So again, I would encourage you to reach out to your psychologist, your speech pathologist, your OTs, your teachers of record, your behavior specialist, anybody who might be in charge of this, and get them to chunk it down into something that we can understand. I would also encourage you to work with those staff. As a psychologist, I know nobody wants me to sit and read my report to you. I usually have given it in advance, and there's a lot of stuff in there that needs to be in there, but doesn't necessarily need to be read aloud. Get to the meat of it. What does it mean? What does it mean for eligibility? What does it mean for planning for the student? How does it turn into things that are important into the IEP or the behavior plan, or any of the other pieces and parts that it might affect? So just encourage them. I've had times where I've been in meetings and somebody starts to read their report, and I'm like, how about you just hit the high points? How about you boil it down? Give me the meat of this, and not just read every word of it. Think about, is there anything preparation-wise that should be given in advance? Whether it's a report or a summary, a draft of the IEP, any of this kind of stuff that might help cut down on your time, help everyone feel like they're coming in on the same level and not with a group of people knowing something and maybe the parent doesn't know any of it yet. So the more that you can give, the better. Now, IEP drafts is something that we generally give to help us and help the parent. It is not required by law. So if you're not ready to give a draft, don't. That's okay. But coming in with something printed, I do better when I'm actually looking at something than just hearing about it. And most people are going to probably tell you something similar. So having that can be a real benefit to everyone. But again, not a legal requirement for that. Now, reports, we know that we have the legal requirement if a parent requests it to provide it at least 5 days prior to the meeting for an initial. After that, the requirement is not there. So again, I still, as a psychologist, would rather give any of my reports in advance so that if anyone has questions, they have an opportunity to reach out to me and get those answered before the meeting. I wouldn't want to ask a lot of clarification questions if I were a parent during that meeting. I would feel intimidated to do that. So having that ahead of time would be very beneficial. And then make sure that if there is any bad news to deliver, don't hand it out the first time at a meeting. Document those parent contacts ahead of time, those phone calls, those emails, private meetings, all of that kind of stuff. Document, and try to get that done prior to. I mean, I've had too many times where I've sat in a meeting and somebody has said, well, your child has missed this many days of school, and the parent says, wait, what? I haven't heard about this. Or disciplinary incidents. Oh my gosh, if parent didn't know, and we're talking about, that this has happened 10 times in the last month, you're going to have a parent that shuts down at that point. Okay, let's talk about some things that can happen during the meeting or on the day of the meeting. And the first is starting with the greeting. Work with your front office secretaries. Let them know who to expect, when to expect them, that they're there for an IEP meeting. Really, really important. If a parent walks in and then the secretary's scrambling around trying to figure out who's this meeting with, who sometimes parents, even if they know you, will say, oh, I'm not sure who I'm meeting with. So have them expect them and greet them appropriately. Sometimes you walk into a building and you get the deadpan, may I help you? And other times you get the welcome to our school. We're happy to have you here. Who can I call for you? It's a different feel right from the beginning. And also really try to consider not having everyone sitting in a room and gather all your bodies and waiting to usher the parent in at the last minute. I've seen physical reactions from parents who walked into a room and went, whoa, so many people. It's overwhelming. So even if more people are there, because you want to show that everybody's on time and they're waiting, they're ready for this meeting. But even if you can have them stand and then allow the parent to kind of sit where they want to sit and then fill in around them, it's a different feel. And every little tweak that we can make like this can make a big difference for how parents feel during that meeting. And if we can take the emotions down and the anxiety down for some of these meetings, you're going to get better parent participation. So seat them in a great place, seat them where they want to sit, seat them where they can see. If you're going to have charts or projection during this, think about a good place for them to sit. Try not to put them on the end of a long table where they feel like they're, under judgment. And then try to make sure that they can sit either with or away from somebody that they specifically want to. Sometimes you've got two parents there who are no longer together and would rather not even be in the same space, but just don't force a parent into a seating situation that makes them uncomfortable. We're trying to create good communication, and we're trying to make them feel as welcome as possible. And on that note of being welcoming, this doesn't mean you need to have a buffet, but if you can have water or even like Starlight mints, something like that to kind of take the edge off of things on the table. A lot of us have this kind of thing in our conference rooms already. But think about, is it a 9 o'clock meeting? It may not be a big deal, but if we're meeting at 11:30, some of you are probably thinking right now, I need to eat lunch, and maybe you can while you're watching this too. But when it becomes lunchtime, that's what I'm thinking about, is lunch. And I've had some meetings that have been 7-hour extravaganzas, and you're starving by that time. So think about how long, think about the time of day. Also recognize that, most of your staff are going to come in, I've got my water bottle handy. I've got my coffee cup handy. I'm usually prepared where I go. Some people are not. You're lucky to have them there at the table. And so they're going to be kind of at a disadvantage. On that same note, we get a lot of parents who may not come prepared with like a pen, a notebook, anything like that, when all of us tend to be sitting around with our laptops or notepads or anything like that. So I try to, when we go to trainings like at a hotel, they tend to put that stuff out for us. I just steal. I steal as much as I can. They're giving us those pens and paper. If I could take those with me to a school and just have them so that they can have this available for any parent to use. I mean, it takes the edge off. It tries to even the playing field a little bit, and it's something super easy that you can do. Make sure and do not skimp on the introductions. Don't assume that everyone knows each other. And if you can train your staff to introduce not just their name, but why are they there at the meeting? What's their purpose at the meeting? I'm here to talk about how he's doing in social studies and some of the behavior that I've seen. I'm here to talk about his motor skills, whatever it is. And as the public agency representative, if you can say, my role today, I'm the assistant principal, but I'm going to serve as the public agency representative, because you may have multiple administrators at a meeting and the parent needs to know who is serving as the PAR. But you can say, so my role is to help this meeting go smoothly, and also to make sure that we come up with a plan that the district can do. Try to keep your formality level even across the board, meaning we don't want to introduce, Dr. McKinney and Mrs. Smith, and then mom or Jan, or, whatever mom's name is. Again, when you do something like that, it automatically kind of sets up that power differential that we're trying to minimize as much as possible. So, just try to keep, I like just first names, I try to just introduce myself as Angie, and I'm the school psychologist, and I do this and blah, blah, blah. And that way, when we start just using first names, the parent's going to feel more comfortable. I try to point out if there are specific roles that are being used during the meeting too, because sometimes it helps a parent to understand why different computers are up. That can be a little intimidating too. But if I can point out that, the public agency representative has his computer up because he's logged into our student database to be able to look at attendance and anything else we need from there. And the teacher of record may have his computer up so that he can work on the IEP as we go along. And then somebody else may have their computer up because they are the note taker. They're taking lots of notes as we go along. Anybody else really should have those computers shut down unless they have a specific role. But if you have a timekeeper, you may want to point that out, that so-and-so is going to keep us on time today, and point out when we have a certain amount of time left or anything like that. I do a lot of facilitated IEPs and always use several key tools, and one is an agenda. I have an actual, full-size printed agenda, and it really doesn't have very much detail on it. Welcome and introductions, ground rules, present levels of performance, goals, provisions, wrap up. Super simple. But the important part of having an agenda is to say, this is the IEP process, and we're going to follow this process. And it is easy for me, once we say, okay, we're good with sticking to this and following this process, that if we get off track and start talking about something before we should, for example, we start talking about a student's accommodations before we've even gotten through present levels, or we start talking about placement options when we haven't even developed their goals, the process happens in order for a reason. And having a formal agenda just allows me to say, let me show you where this is on the agenda. We're not there yet, but we will discuss this when we get there. It kind of validates a person that, okay, I'm not ignoring you. We will discuss it, but not until we get here. And it helps pull us back to exactly what we need to. There are times when I add more detail to an agenda because something is like all we can think about, the placement, or, we're there just because we haven't been able to get agreement on a math goal. And so I show exactly where that's going to happen during the meeting. And that just, it keeps everybody, I guess, a little calmer, knowing that it's coming. We're just not there yet. I always use ground rules as well, and they're pretty, mundane kind of ground rules that you would use really for any meeting. But by presenting some potential ground rules and getting everyone to verbally agree to these ahead of time, when I have to enforce them, nobody seems to get upset. But just like in a classroom, you can't make up the rules as you go along. You have to have the rules before you can enforce them. Because if I try to enforce a rule that I haven't even gotten agreement on yet, I'm going to have a really hard time getting people to stick with that. So we put a copy of this on the Padlet with just some potential ground rules that you can use. There's some things that you can print directly from the Padlet on this. Developing respect. Part of this comes from respect in general, of respect for your time, right? Showing up at the meeting on time, ending at the time that we said we were going to meet, or scheduling another meeting if we can't get everything done. Not talking about things other than this student and this IEP. Being respectful of input. And part of what you can do to show some respect is repeating things. Even if I don't agree with it, if somebody gives some input and I can repeat it back to them and say, I just want to make sure I got this right, so that when we start considering things, I'll have it right. It shows you're listening, you hear it. It doesn't say that you necessarily agree yet, but just making sure that you acknowledge people. Using good body language, good eye contact, and then making sure that you're not doing other things. And sometimes I know, as a public agency representative, you're the person who tends to get called out for the emergency, get called out because, the bus is running late, and oh my gosh, what are we going to do about that? Because of being a required member, technically, you should not leave a meeting unless the parent has agreed ahead of time that you might miss part of the meeting and that you've given all your input and all that kind of stuff. But your role is so important as a public agency representative that you really have to commit to this time. And I know that's sometimes hard. Life gets in the way sometimes, but make every effort that you can to be a part of the meeting from start to finish. And then eliminating sidebar conversations. And what I try to do during those, sometimes it's hard to get a handle on those because many of them are productive, right? It's a gen ed teacher and a special ed teacher who start talking about what could we do about this. And they are, I mean, they really are having good conversation, but it detracts from the overall meeting. We either need to have everyone involved, or there are times when I call for a break. Most of the time when I call for a break, it's because a parent and somebody that they have brought, whether it's an advocate or support person or a family member, they're having a sidebar. And if I say, I know you guys obviously have something important to talk about, how about we take 5 minutes and either we can leave the room so you can talk privately, or you guys can go out in the hall and then come back in. It again acknowledges that what they have is important, but it doesn't feel as uncomfortable to have, you know, that sidebar happening within the course of the meeting. All right, notice of procedural safeguards. Again, the Padlet video will talk about all of the different times that you have to provide the notice. But it is really helpful if you can develop your own little kind of elevator speech on parent rights, because most of the time, and think to your own IEP experiences where you've gone into meetings and you have the teacher of record who pushes that packet of paper across the table and says, I need to give you a copy of your parent rights or your notice of procedural safeguards. I know you've got a million copies of these at home. If you leave it on the table when you leave, that's okay, but I have to physically give it to you, blah, blah, blah. You know, it's the same speech every year. And then they usually say, do you have any questions? Now, what parent is going to say, well, yes, I do. I have gone through this document and I've got my list of questions. Almost inevitably, they say nope, right? Because they're not sure what to ask. So to have a quick but flexible speech about, let me tell you the most important things that you need to know that are within your parent rights about your meeting today. Whether it's confidentiality, whether it's, you know, signature, getting a copy of your the notice after we do this IEP meeting, whatever the most important things are, shouldn't take but like a minute and a half for this verbal explanation. But really, when we talk about a parent providing informed consent, I feel like a lot of our parents aren't really informed. They give a lot of consent to things that they're not exactly sure what they're consenting to. And the more that we can help demonstrate that for our teachers so that they start to do the same things during these meetings, the better. All right, using good language is always important. You know, respectful language, professional language, but not jargon. And it's hard sometimes. As a psychologist, I tend to talk like a psychologist, and I have to work really hard to not talk like a psychologist. As educators, you probably, a lot of you speak the educational language that some of our parents don't understand. So the best thing that you can really do when you're talking about jargon and acronyms and things like that is just question them during the meeting. You know, when somebody says, well, NWEA scores showed this, you say, NWEA, can you explain exactly what NWEA is? Explain what DIBELS is. Explain what, you know, whatever it is that we're using. Because our parents won't ask most of the time. And I think it's really important for us to kind of set that stage. Make sure and encourage, because this probably won't be you in most cases, it'll be other people at the meeting. Encourage people to stick to facts. There are a lot of things that can instantly get someone on the defensive. For example, if a teacher comes in and says, you know, Johnny, he's just so unmotivated in my class, you're going to get a defensive parent right away. But if you can come in with data that says, in my class, over the last 3 weeks, I've been counting, and Johnny puts his head down on the desk at least 3 times per class period. And in general, it takes me probably 3 prompts before I get him to bring his head back up. Well, I don't know whether that's because he's bored, he's unmotivated, he's tired, he's drugged, he's hungry. I don't know. But what I do know is what I saw. And I think when we stick with the facts and the data, we get parents that say, okay, let me tell you about this. Or we can problem solve better, and we can have better conversations when we're using data. Also make sure that present levels are present levels, it's current. If we come into an IEP meeting and what we've got listed in the present levels of performance is 6 months old, it's not present anymore. We also want to make sure that we give positives, but we also give realistic information. When we have a lot of negatives, you want to balance with positives, but you also don't want to sugarcoat the information where a parent is misled into thinking my child is doing, fantastic, or my child's on grade level. Well, most of the time that's not going to be the case for a student that requires an IEP. Okay, so just really quickly in the chat, and while you do this in the chat, I'm going to check the Q&A and kind of see where we are there. What is a word or a phrase that you've heard, like unmotivated, that tends to be a trigger? And make sure that when you type in the chat that you change the default to the message going to everyone, not just to panelists and presenters. So any word or phrase that when it comes out of somebody's mouth, oh boy, we're going to get a reaction. Okay, and I also see the chat is disabled. Oh my goodness. Well, that's why nobody's typing in the chat. Okay, well, and I know my technology guy is no longer on here, so I'm not sure how to fix that. I guess we're just going to have to skip the chat things. So if you want to add anything into the Q&A, that would be great. And I'll try to keep an eye on that as well. Okay, I sometimes use a parking lot, and I actually use, a visible chart that says parking lot. And I sometimes will put things on the parking lot that are down further in the agenda, just to visibly show someone, I appreciate that you said this, we're going to get to it later, and I'm going to put it right here. Other times I tend to put things on a parking lot that the IEP team does not need to deal with, but it's very important to the parent. So, I mean, you maybe can think of a time when, what the parent wants to talk about is the fact that they keep getting notices from the library saying this book is missing, right? Not an IEP team issue, but very important to the parent. Or low lunch balance, or the child's had too many extra charges on their lunch account or something like that. Sometimes it has to do with another student, so-and-so and this kid are not getting along. Again, important for the parent. And so if I put it on the parking lot, then we figure out we're going to address this, but not necessarily during this meeting, because this doesn't take all of the other bodies who have committed their time to being at this meeting. There are also a lot of other techniques that we tend to use when we kind of get stuck, or we're clearly everybody's not on the same page. And I'm not going to go through all of these because, again, we have a longer training that kind of covers this. And I want to make sure we have plenty of time to talk about manifestation determinations. But there are just lots of different ways that we can, instead of just saying we've got to pick A or B, we purposefully look at the options and figure out, what's really going to be best for the student that that still would constitute a free, appropriate public education. Really use those tools that you have, your agenda and ground rules. Sometimes you have to just acknowledge the elephant in the room, stating the obvious that nobody seems to want to state out loud. And sometimes that happens, clearly you want this and clearly somebody else thinks this is a better option. Okay, now that we've said that, we can process through it. I do a lot of boomeranging during meetings because I don't want to be the person with the answer, because I'm not. It's a case conference committee. It is a group of people that makes a decision. And so when somebody asks a question, I try to throw it back to them first. Well, tell me your thoughts on that. What would you suggest here? So that we're not just, it's not looking for the answer. It's looking for different opinions that are out there. I use a lot of humor during meetings, but I always make sure and direct it at myself, because you just can't predict how humor is going to be taken by somebody else's. And it could be offensive to some people. So I just always, make jokes about myself or, my understanding of something, or I'll say, oh my gosh, I totally misunderstood that, even if I didn't, because sometimes that's what it takes to break the tension. And then accepting and legitimizing, I think, is really important too. Again, just writing things down. I do a lot of visual charting during meetings, because people like to see that, yes, I said that, and it's up there. It's being acknowledged. Breaks whenever you need it. Sometimes I was at a meeting recently where we only had like 20 minutes left in our allotted time, but clearly there was a need for a break. And you think, oh my gosh, if we take a 5-minute break, we're down to 15 minutes. But those 15 minutes would have been a complete loss if we hadn't taken that 5-minute break. And somehow we got done. So, I mean, it's one of those things that it can help you not only kind of break from your conversation or cool off a little bit, but it also is sometimes I take a break because I'm like, I don't know, I need to go look this up. I need to make sure that we're doing this right, or I need to make a quick call and figure something out. I also want to always make sure I'm not assuming that silence means I agree. So when I'm trying to get agreement on something, eye contact from person to person, and I'm looking for a thumbs up, a head nod, a verbal yes, or a no, before I move on. Because you can probably all think of at least one meeting where you thought everyone was on the same page, and somebody came back later, usually the parent, and says, well, I never agreed to that. So you want to really get good participation in some way. And then as you're kind of winding down the meeting, talk to the parents about what happens next. And somebody should walk that parent out, and we should all kind of go our merry way. Because if we all sit there while a parent is dismissed basically from a room, their assumption is we're going to sit there and talk about them. And we want to make sure that we're continuing to build that relationship with that collaborative spirit. And so this is one more thing, that even if you've got another meeting that's going to happen and we're all the same people coming to this meeting, some people should go to the bathroom, get a drink, do something, right? Just to show that we're done with this meeting and we're breaking apart. As far as letting the parent know what happens next, we've got a time period, and we're going to talk about this here in a second, about providing them the written notice or the copy of the IEP. And I, as a parent, would want to know, are you going to give it to me today? Is it likely going to show up tomorrow? Are you going to mail it? Are you going to email it? What should I expect? And I think that we don't always know for sure exactly when we're going to be able to get something to a parent, but we can at least give them a ballpark and talk with them about, what would they like to happen as far as delivery of the information. All right, so let's talk about that written notice. So Article 7 says that within 10 business days, now this is different than most days that we see in Article 7. This is most of the places talk about instructional days. In this one, it says that parents have to get a copy of the written notice. And in Indiana, we've got everything that's required in the written notice built into the IEP. So the IEP serves as the written notice of what we are proposing to do within 10 business days of holding that meeting. That means they have to get it in their hands. So I can't mail it on the 10th day. They have to actually receive it within 10 banking days, basically Monday through Fridays, whether we're in school or not. Then we get another timeline that starts. So when parents get this IEP, if it is anything other than an initial, then the clock starts ticking again, and we will implement that IEP on the 11th instructional or school day after the parent gets the copy, unless they sign it to start sooner, right? If we want to start something right away, we want to have them sign it, or unless they challenge it in one of the official challenge ways. Now, the challenges are all at the back of the IEP, so it's printed every time, but the only thing that really stops a subsequent IEP from going into place on that 11th instructional day is if a parent requests a meeting with somebody from the school who has the authority to negotiate those differences in what they feel should be in the IEP and what was presented to them, or if they go to mediation, or if they go into file for due process. Those are the only three things. So saying, I don't like this, does not stop an IEP from going into place. It probably would prompt us to say, well, how about I have a meeting with just me and you, right? Saying or filing a complaint does not stop an IEP from going into place. And sometimes we kind of don't realize that. So those are the only three challenges to the IEP. Okay, I'm not going to do this either. So I'll have to remember this for next time, but we are going to jump now into manifestation determinations, which I am sure is like your favorite type of meeting, right? Yeah, not so much. I don't mind manifestation determinations, and they are incredibly important, but if I could pick the type of meeting I was going to go to, that would not be my top meeting. So we're going to look at first, what do you need to know about it? And things that you need to do as a public agency representative. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how do I try to not get there in the first place, because that's even better when we don't have to have those meetings. All right, so here we're going to start with the Article 7 definition, and I want to dissect this just a little bit. This is, again, straight out of Article 7. Number one, it is an evaluative process, which means we're pulling together lots of information and we're evaluating the situation. The next important piece is that it is conducted by the case conference committee, not by a single person. And I know I feel like I did these wrong for many years, because in my role as an assistant director, I would run a lot of manifestation determination meetings. And I was always under the impression that, we would all talk and then I would basically make a ruling. And that's not the way it really works. That's not the way it's supposed to work, at least. So the case conference committee, just like any other meeting, is coming together to try and come up with, the most appropriate decision based on all of the data in that evaluative process. And our purpose then at this meeting is to figure out whether what the student got in trouble for, so the conduct in question, whether it was caused by their disability or had a direct and substantial relationship to their disability, or whether it was the result of our failure to implement the student's IEP. A lot of times this comes down to a student not having their behavior plan followed. I mean, that's not the only situation that might result in that, but that's probably the more common situation. So here are some things as we're trying to figure all of this out. Here's some things that you need to know. Number one is, in Article 7, they don't talk about suspensions, they don't talk about expulsion, they talk about days of removal. And if you remove a student for any part of the day, you have to count it as a full day of removal. So don't do it unless you absolutely have to, right? Because you don't want to waste a whole day of removal. The only exception really to that is if it is a very short-term removal that is built into the IEP, that is part of, this is absolutely important to implementing the student's IEP, then sometimes you will find things built into a behavior plan or something related to the health of the student that says a short-term removal, meaning maybe I need to go down to a reset room or a sensory room for a period of time during the day, and it is part of what happens in my IEP. We would not count that as a removal. So in general, suspension is a removal. Expulsion obviously is a removal. In-school suspension is a little bit different. You have to count them as a day of removal, even though the student is at school, unless you can meet both of these criteria. If the student is able to progress in the gen ed curriculum and gets all their special ed services that are in the IEP, just like they would have any other day, and they participate at school with non-disabled students to the same extent that they would have in their placement on their IEP, then you don't count them as a removal. Now, this can be done, but it also is really hard if you have a special ed teacher who is already going to multiple rooms and providing services. Then finding time to work with a student who is in school may be very difficult. So, it's, like I said, it can be done, but it is not the easiest thing to accomplish. But unless you can meet both of those bullet points, you would have to count those as a day of removal. Transportation. If I'm a student and I ride a regular bus and I get kicked off the bus, now it's just an inconvenience to my parents to drive me to school, right? Just like anybody else. That would not be counted as a day of removal. If somebody doesn't haul me to school, I'm absent for the day because I haven't been suspended from school. However, if transportation is on my IEP as a service and I am removed from the bus, then the school needs to either count it as a day of removal, which I would suggest that you try not to do that, or the school would need to provide alternate transportation. So maybe I can't ride on this bus that I normally would ride on, but we can get an Uber to bring you to school, or I can pay the parents mileage to bring you to school. If you're at school, then you don't have to count that as a removal. But if I'm kicked off that special bus or special transportation and I don't come to school, we have to count it as a day of removal. And all of this is important because as we add up those days of removal, we're looking at whether or not a disciplinary change of placement has occurred. This is what drives us to whether or not we need a manifestation determination meeting. If we have more than 10 consecutive days, boom, automatically we know a change of placement has occurred. That's a long period of time. I was just off for vacation, and that was a long period of time to be away from work, right? You get used to different things. If we're talking about cumulative days and we have more than 10 days um, that build up to being more than 10, then the public agency has to decide, not the case conference, but the school and the public agency generally, we're talking, about the representative working with maybe the director, has to determine whether a change of placement has occurred or not. There are very few situations where we would not think that a change of placement has occurred. Maybe if the behaviors are always different and it's really spread out across the entire school year, but I can tell you that most districts have just decided that when we cross the line of more than 10 days, we are just going to automatically say that a change of placement has occurred so that we don't make the mistake of saying it didn't when it did. But again, you're probably going to have an in-house policy on how that happens. So when we get to this point and we say, okay, we've crossed that line and we now have a disciplinary change of placement, first thing we have to do is notify the parent and send a copy of the notice of procedural safeguards. So again, this one is a more unusual situation where we have to give that notice, but really important that it goes out. It's supposed to happen on the day that the decision is made to make that removal that would cross that 10-day line. Sometimes that can't happen, right? Sometimes maybe I got in a fight at the basketball game and I'm up for some kind of discipline that's going to cross that line, but nobody's in their office to send that stuff home, or if you can't get that to the parent on the day of, then you have to mail it the following business day in order to be compliant. Then we have to both schedule and actually hold the manifestation determination meeting within 10 instructional days, or 10 days that we're actually in school, of the date that the decision is made to hand down that discipline. Okay, so again, maybe the fight occurred on Tuesday. We did some investigation for a couple of days. On Friday, we determined, yes, we believe it happened and you're up for this suspension that's going to cross the 10-day line. That is the date that the decision has been made to hand down this change of placement. And so that's the date that we're talking about. 10 instructional days from there is when we need to hold the meeting. And on that day, we need to send home the notice of procedural safeguards. A lot of timelines, I know. And this is why it's so important for you as a public agency representative to understand this and make sure that we stick within those timelines, because these are ones that tend to result in complaints when we don't meet every little detail of the requirements. So why do you need to know all this stuff? Well, if we can communicate and be very clear on our understanding of these, then we tend to not mess up on counting days, and we tend to be able to provide the services that we need to. So keep your teachers of record in the loop. Make sure that they know every time a student is up for discipline, because sometimes they don't know. Make sure that we're counting every removal day accurately so that we don't get in a situation where we have miscounted. If you are going to try to provide services while a student is in in-school suspension, whether that's allowing the student to go to the teacher to receive their services, or figuring out a way that the teacher can come in and provide those within whatever in-school setting, however you can make that work, you just got to make sure that everybody's aware and planning for this and has the coverage that they need. And the earlier that we can intervene on disciplinary issues, the better. You don't want to wait until we are almost to that, crossing that 10-day line to say, yeah, well, I think we ought to maybe put a better behavior plan in place here, right? We want to back that up. And I know a lot of districts have, again, in-house policies and procedures that may say when you hit 3 days or 5 days of removal, that we will initiate the functional behavioral assessment process, or that we'll have a conference to discuss what to do next. Again, none of that is in Article 7. It is really good practice. So I would encourage you to look and see if your district or your cooperative has any in-house policy on that. So when we have manifestation meetings, we're going to look at all the information and try to figure out whether or not the conduct was either related to the disability or because we didn't implement the student's IEP. Now, we need enough information when we're talking about reviewing all the information. I'm going to look at the file. I'm going to look at the previous evaluations. I want to know what happened, like what led up to this, what, how did it all play out? I absolutely have to know the characteristics of the student's disability, not just the label, right? Every student with other health impairment is different. Every student with autism is different. Every student with an emotional disability is different. What does my emotional disability look like? And what are the characteristics that we're consistently seeing so that I can see when the behavior happened, was it related to that? Or was it just misbehavior, right? Not every behavior that occurs is because of a disability. So looking historically, what's my behavior been like? Is there anything else that we're suspecting? What are the characteristics of a suspected disability, even if we haven't identified it yet? Did we implement the IEP? Did we follow a behavior plan if there is one? Was it an appropriate behavior plan? There are all those things that we have to look at to make the decision so that we can go back and look at both number 1 and number 2, because either of them are important. Okay, skip forward again here. So if we answer yes to either, then we say that it's a manifestation of the student's disability. Now, if we say yes to number 2, that it was because we were not implementing the IEP, or whether it's part of it or all of it, first thing you do is fix it, right? Why were we not? Was it because certain people didn't know about the behavior plan and so they weren't following it? Was it because, sometimes we have things that are on an IEP that we haven't been able to get them kind of put into place yet. Fix those things. That's definitely the first thing to do. But no matter what, if we've said yes to either of those and we've said yes, this is a manifestation of the student's disability, then we have to either conduct a functional behavioral assessment and then implement a behavior plan, or if one's already in place, we've got to take a look at it and see, is it appropriate? Do we need to change things? And I would say most times we're going to need to change something. If we've gotten to the point of needing a manifestation determination, even if we have a plan, probably some tweaks would be helpful. Then, now here's the kicker, right? This is an important thing to know. If it is because of the student's disability or because of our failure to implement the IEP, the student is entitled to be returned to the placement that the IEP, the previous IEP, said that they should be in, unless, because we're modifying the behavior plan, a different placement might be appropriate. Now, the biggest thing you need to do is to document this within the behavior plan. Document the discussion if you're going to all agree to a placement. But I can tell you right now, it's important to tell parents that your child is entitled to go back exactly where they were. That's the first option. A parent would have to agree to a change in order for you to put a change on the IEP. And it would really need to be that we're modifying the behavior plan, and as part of that, we're really going to have a change of placement. Don't let this be a situation where you're jumping to a homebound placement just because of what the student did. Because again, if it's part of their if it's part of their disability, then we want to make sure that we have an opportunity to have as much contact with this kid as possible in order to work on the behavior issues, right? I mean, obviously, we need to have good access to them. They need to be able to practice new skills. We need to be able to teach them new skills. And that's really hard to do in a homebound placement. I know sometimes that feels like that's an easier option, but it can also get you into a bit of hot water in making that jump to homebound placement, because placements fall along a continuum, and you want to make sure that you're not jumping way down a continuum. And homebound is the most restrictive placement on that continuum. So now there are those times where you say, had nothing to do with your disability. We were following the IEP. You've made a bad decision, right? We've all made bad decisions. In those cases, the school can proceed with their disciplinary procedures. But one of the provisions in a student's rights or the notice of procedural safeguards is that a student's education has to continue if they have an IEP. And so we have to meet, and the case conference committee needs to determine, what do you need? What do you need to continue to make progress, to participate in the gen ed curriculum, not in the gen ed setting, but in the gen ed curriculum? And also, do you need a functional behavioral assessment and behavior plan so that when you do come back, we're not in this boat again. We're not having those same issues. Now, the exception to this is in the most severe cases. So the public agency can remove a student to an interim alternative educational setting for 45 school days or less in a situation where they brought a weapon to school, they were using illegal drugs or possessing illegal drugs or trying to sell a controlled substance, or they inflicted serious bodily injury upon another person. Now, I want to emphasize here, serious bodily injury, they mean serious, right? This is not that I got in a fight. This is not that I broke your arm even. I mean, that sounds pretty serious to me, but the courts have really come down on this and said, you know, you've got to have lost a limb, lost an eye, experienced organ failure. You really need to have nearly died in order for us to consider this serious bodily injury. Now, I want to remind you though, if I get in a fight, I still have discipline. I still could end up in a manifestation. We're going to go through all those same processes. The only difference here is it has to be even more serious in order for somebody to say, I don't care whether there's a manifestation relationship or not. You need to be somewhere else for this many days in order for everyone to be safe. So has to be super, super serious. And it also can't be the potential of inflicting serious bodily injury. It has to have actually occurred. So again, in this case, we would hold that manifestation determination meeting, but regardless of the outcome, that student is going to remain in that setting until either that 45 days has expired or the committee feels like the student needs to come back. So at these meetings, at these meetings, make sure that your teachers are bringing data, or that everybody is bringing data, because we have to be considering all this stuff. So not just the academic piece and the behavioral piece in general, but also what have they tried? How often have they seen this? What are they seeing relating to the characteristics of the student's disability? And I want to give you an example of this too, because, you know, a lot of times we think, okay, well, if we have a student identified as other health impaired for ADHD, then most likely, you know, anything that we find that's impulsive, that it's going to be related to their disability. Well, some kids with ADHD have an impulsive type of ADHD, But we have other students who can be very inattentive, but non-impulsive, right? So that's why it's so important to know, what does this student's disability look like? Because then when I look at the behavior incident, if something was planned out for a week before it happened, that's not an impulsive act, right? So even if I have an impulsive type of ADHD, if I have clearly planned something, it may not be related to my disability. Always important to get the information that's needed to make a really good decision. So again, try to find out as much as you can and act as early as you can to make sure that we're all on the same page. Make sure that everybody knows their part. So having a way for your teachers to document that everyone who needs to know about a student's IEP is getting either a copy of the IEP or an IEP at a glance, and that all of those people have gotten information about, the importance of confidentiality. So in some cases, you may have recess attendants or bus drivers or the basketball coach or somebody like that that needs to know about a student's IEP that's not normally getting a good dose of, why information has to be kept confidential. If those people are on a need to know basis about a student's IEP, if I'm likely to have problems in the cafeteria and maybe my teacher's not in there, then those folks need to know if I have a behavior plan so that everything gets followed. But again, we need to make sure that they also understand what their responsibilities are for implementation and for confidentiality. Sometimes with the milder behavior problems, we may be able to just do interventions or just simply have a behavior goal. But if we need a formal behavior plan, it's important that we conduct a functional behavioral assessment. That when you look at the definition of a behavior plan in Article 7, it says that it is based on a functional behavioral assessment. So that ensures that we're trying to construct a plan that is not working against us, because sometimes we try things that actually are feeding the beast, right? We don't want to try a plan that is going to make things worse. And that's why a functional behavioral assessment can be really helpful. Try to do it as early as you need to. It doesn't need to be done for everyone, but certainly if we're showing a pattern of behaviors, we want to go ahead and get that started prior to the point of ever needing a manifestation. And then maybe we won't need a manifestation determination later. Consult the people who live and breathe behavior, your behavior specialists, your ED teachers, your school psychologists, autism consultants. All of those folks really have a good handle on behavior and can be really helpful. And then as you get to that point, and this is another place where as a public agency representative, you can be really helpful if when we hit the question in the IEP that asks, does the student's behavior interfere with the student's learning or the learning of others, that we really have a discussion about that. For 90% of our kids, it's an easy no. For the kids that we think, well, maybe, if you're leaning towards maybe, it probably should be a yes. And I know that forces you into completing a lot of other things in the IEP, but you're better off doing that than later having someone question why, when behaviors have been occurring for a long period of time, we've not had a functional behavioral assessment and behavior plan. Okay, so some more tips. You're going to review the information, but don't treat this like a disciplinary hearing, right? I've attended some meetings where it's like the reading of the charges is how we start. On September 14th of this year, the student did enact and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, you are already going to have a parent, anyone the parent has brought, and the student who just shuts down and is like, I know how this is going to go. It also sets up the possibility of trying to dispute the charges. And that's not what this meeting is for. The administration who dealt with discipline has already done that. They've investigated, they have determined, they have handed down discipline. This is not where we say, I didn't do it, he started it, any of that kind of stuff. This is saying, here's the behavior that you got in trouble for. Our job is to look at that connection between the behavior and the disability or the failure to implement the IEP. Always look at those disability characteristics, and remember, this is a case conference committee decision. So we really need to involve the team. It is truly a team decision. Now, as we do that, we're going to be gathering input from everyone and attempting to build consensus. And I will tell you that if we really focus on the behavior and the disability and those characteristics, then we're more likely to actually come to true consensus, rather than it just being like, you don't want to ever have this be like a vote kind of situation, right? You don't want to have it be, all in favor of expulsion, right? That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for truly answering those questions. So we're going to try to build consensus, but sometimes we can't get there. And when we can't have everyone on the same page, then ultimately you guys as the public agency representative, you're responsible for that decision coming out as part of the IEP, right? So not so much fun, but now let's talk about what happens next, okay? Because this happens a lot. We've held a manifestation and it happens again, or something else happens that typically would warrant a suspension or something like that. Now, what do we do, right? Well, one thing that you have to know is that any day beyond 10 days that a student is excluded from school, they are entitled to services. So no matter whether it was a manifestation relationship or not, then if I have any days of removal beyond 10 days, the first 10 days, it's just like anyone else. The school does not need to provide services unless they do so for non-disabled students, and they typically don't. But anything beyond 10 days, we have to give services. But when somebody does something else, the clock does not reset. I don't get to start over at the end of 10 days and say, okay, now we need to, after another 10 days, we'll hold a manifestation. Any removal after you've had a manifestation should result in another meeting. So we want to look at first, is this the same behavior? If it's the same behavior, what did we decide at the manifestation conference that we held before? If it was a relationship, don't remove. I know that's hard for some people to swallow, but what's the purpose of that removal, right? So we want to think about, can something else be modified? Do we need to update the functional behavioral assessment? Do we need to change the behavior plan? Is this placement appropriate? You're much better off discussing a different placement at a non-manifestation meeting, because if it's at a manifestation meeting, you have to have the parents fully on board in order to make a change in placement. It's not the same when you're just proposing at a regular IEP meeting that, what placement would constitute a free appropriate public education. So think about, when you removed before, did it work? If it didn't work then, why would it work now? I mean, most of our removals, let's just be completely honest, most of our removals are because we need a break. As the adults in the school, we need for this kid to just maybe be gone for a couple of days and let's regroup, let's rethink. Most of the time, it doesn't affect a student's behavior. It's never really been proven to work. So we need to think about what else could we do? What other services could we provide? What could we do to build up that behavior plan? And I don't really have an answer to that because, you know, it's different in every district, the opportunities that they have, whether it's, you know, a really good in-school program or an alternative to suspension program. I worked in a district for a while that, well, actually it was several school districts combined to work with their local probation department. And they had an alternative to suspension program where a student got their special ed services if they had them, or just regular teaching services if they were a non-disabled student, and then they spent half a day doing community service, like picking up trash at the local cemetery, or, you know, things like that. But they were getting what they needed. They were in with non-disabled peers. So just like an in-school kind of situation, they were able to do that, not as a removal, and they got something out of it, right? But it's different every place you go. So just get creative. Think about, you know, I don't want to be at these meetings, and you know, homebound services can be expensive too, and they're not good for kids because, again, these kids are ones that need to be with other students to practice the appropriate behavior in order to ever get better at those things. All right, so let's talk about specific ways that the public agency can kind of help keep us in compliance, because we want to do good things for kids, but we also want to stay out of hot water. And I think none of us ever wants to contribute to our district being out of compliance for something. So one of the things that you can do is truly serve the role. Be at those meetings, and when you are the public agency representative, you are there from start to finish, and that you are an active participant. And really, if you can handle the meeting process and allow your teacher to be fully involved in the content, you will see a difference in the quality of the IEPs, the conversation that happens between the teacher and the parent. And you might actually see more IEPs being cleaned up and finished by the end of your meeting and ready to present to the parent than you would if the teacher is trying to do everything, take the notes, have the conversation, make the corrections. It is overwhelming for teachers of record to try and accomplish all these things at once. Every single meeting, make sure that there is truly a discussion about the least restrictive environment for students. If you think about all of the different potential placements being along a continuum, and if we always think about gen ed placement as being the first option, and sometimes that's hard to think of, especially when a student has been in a more restrictive placement for a long time. We should always start by, could we, if we tweak some things, put some things in place, could we make this happen in a gen ed setting? If we can't, and we've had that good discussion, then we can move on to thinking about a more restrictive placement. But we've got to start there. We've got to start with the gen ed possibility first. And again, this is something where you as the public agency representative can really be the leader in that, because otherwise what we tend to default to is, where were they last year? Okay, let's start by thinking about that. And then we rarely make changes that pull kids back to a less restrictive setting. It happens occasionally, but it is definitely not the norm. Always be aware. Keep a list, keep a spreadsheet, know who's got an IEP, know who has a behavior plan, have a way to keep track of removals, so that, I mean, be stingy with those days of removals. Just because the student handbook says that a fight should result in 3 days of suspension on, the first time it happens. If you have a student that that's a chronic problem, maybe you don't want to use 3 days that first time. Maybe you want to give a day of removal and then, beef up the behavior plan more. But I mean, you don't want to be tied to these meetings all the time. And so if you can keep track of that and really think ahead, and be a little flexible with that, you might have fewer of those kinds of meetings. Document, document, document. Not all of this is going to be you, but making sure that your staff have a way of getting this stuff documented. So a lot of teachers of record, as they give an IEP at a glance to their colleagues, will have a signature page for them to sign off on that, I've gotten it and I don't have any questions about my responsibilities. Having a way that things that are needing to be provided in an IEP actually happen, that the accommodations are happening, that their services are happening, that if you have staff that needed training on something, that you have a way to document that. And then every time that you have an interaction with a parent, sometimes those might be more appropriate to document in the IEP communications, or they may just be in your student information system. As long as they're somewhere, just any interaction with parents, having that documented can really cover you in times of it being questioned. And then, there's a bunch of other stuff that you want to document, and you probably already have some mechanisms for documenting that. As you do your walkthroughs, for any of you who are in that administrative role where you're doing walkthroughs in classrooms, look for IEP implementation. There are going to be kids with disabilities in pretty much every classroom you go into. The more that you show that I'm looking for you to do your part when the student is in the gen ed room, the old saying of what is inspected is respected. Absolutely. If people know that you're looking for those things and that it's important, it's going to be more likely to happen. Be the Article 7 person. I have Article 7 downloaded to my computer, and it is a PDF that's searchable. And I probably open it and search in it a couple of times per day because it's not an easy read, right? There's so many things that we're not even covering today. And it is really important that you have a way to quickly check on things and make sure that you are the resource in your building, you're the go-to person. And when you don't know, that you know who to refer on to, your director of special education, or the legal team at the Department of Education, or somebody from our office. Anytime I don't just answer questions. Most of the time I'm like, let me find the exact reference because I don't want to be wrong. And, I think it's not like you always have to know everything, but you'd have to quickly be able to find certain things. This one's a hard one. When you were at the meeting, because you are ultimately the person who has the authority to commit resources, you have to find a balance between what you feel is the most appropriate, right? And what is legally supposed to happen and what parents want. Now, I'm all for flexing and trying to reach, a compromise, but I cannot agree to a compromise that doesn't end up being a free, appropriate public education. And I think that sometimes is really hard because you're going to want to please people. You're going to want to make people happy about and willing to sign an IEP or let it go into play. But at the same time, if you offer something that is not appropriate, even if a parent agreed to it, it will come back to haunt you. Either it will come back to haunt you in that you agreed to something that you will now never get out of, or that you agreed to something and the parent wanted it, but then later got upset about something else. And then a court comes back and says, why in the world would you have ever agreed to that? So it is ultimately going to be your responsibility to say, here's what we're offering, and we believe this meets what the law says is a free, appropriate public education based on everything that we know about your child. It's a hard position to be in. And so again, when you're in a tricky spot, and because most of these meetings aren't that difficult, but when you're in a tricky one, involve your director of special ed, consult with somebody on this so that you're making sure that you're not flexing too much, I guess. Just a couple more tips, and then we'll kind of wrap things up. All right, you have to be aware of the timelines that are out there. So again, making sure that we're providing notices on time, making sure that we're having meetings within the right time, that we're giving documents on all the right times. And there are so many darn timelines in Article 7 that you really have to stay on top of these. So if you know the timelines, then again, you can support your teachers, your therapists, anybody else who has to meet these things as well, just to make sure that that you don't get dinged on something like this. Think beyond the classroom. So as you're planning for the IEP, for many students, the classroom is the biggest concern, right? Needs for instruction, needs for accommodations. That is most of our kids. You will have some students that you have to think beyond that. You're going to have to think about, okay, this kid is likely to try out for and make the basketball team, but he has a deaf or hard of hearing eligibility. Am I going to need to provide an interpreter for practices and games? Yes, you are, if that's what's required. Think about, what happens at recess? What happens when we go on field trips? Field trips are open to all students. And what we can't do are things like tell a parent, your child can go on the field trip as long as one of you attends. We can't do that. We have to think about, what does this student need during this activity time, whatever, anything that's school related, sponsored, and we have to provide it, unless a parent obviously says, I want to go, I want to provide this for them. But just think beyond the classroom, and that's gonna really protect you and protect the student a lot better as well. And then finally, really reinforce that message that all means all, meaning students need to belong. They need to be included in everything that they possibly can. We have to not just think of inclusion as a room, right? It's not a room, it's a mindset. And I think as a public agency representative, I've just heard some beautiful things come out of the PAR's mouths during meetings that I'm like, that was so beautifully said. And you just see a parent kind of go, I feel good about this. I feel good about my kid being at your school, about what you're doing. It really can help build that relationship. All right, I am going to do a quick check here and see what these questions are, if I can get this to move off of your screen. Okay. Ooh, we do have some questions. If a required member has an illness the day of the meeting, do you still need a written excusal? Yes, is my short answer. What I would suggest is, because sometimes you don't know until that morning, or even, sometimes you get sick in the middle of the day and your meeting is at 2 o'clock and somebody disappears. At that point, you're doing the best you can. And so what I would do is get a hold of the parent ahead of time if possible. But if not, when they come, say, I'm so sorry, Mrs. Jones had to go home sick or was not here today. We've got some options. You can excuse them. However, they will not have the written input into the IEP, and you're just, yes, it's a violation, but you know, what are you going to do? Or we could get another person to serve in that role if there is another person that is appropriate to fill that role, a different teacher, another member of the multidisciplinary team, a designee for the PAR, something like that. Or offering and documenting this clearly that we also recognize that that person's important, and if you'd like to reschedule, we can do that. So I think that is probably the best thing that you can do, is giving options and being upfront and transparent with the parent is your best bet. So yes, you won't have the written input, but if you can document this stuff as best as you can in the IEP, then that's really all you can do. Does the 10-day apply to move-ins? Okay, I am not completely sure what that means. Let me start by saying that the law says that when a student moves in, you have 10 instructional days from the day that they come in and say, I'm here, I'm here. You have 10 instructional days to hold a meeting and determine whether or not you need to write a new IEP or implement the IEP as written, which most of the time you're going to write a new but similar IEP. But you have to have that move-in meeting within 10 days. Now, I guess another situation might be, I'm up for expulsion, or I'm up for say a 12-day suspension in a district, and I move into a different district now. You know, as a receiving district, you kind of pick up where the old district left off. So there may be a case where you have to hold a manifestation shortly. That'd be kind of a really horrible situation to be in. Shavette, if you have any more on that, that would be that would help me out. If that wasn't your question, then you can type in another question. The question of, is ISS considered a removal? I know we covered that, but it could be, could not. So again, make sure, if you don't want it to be a day of removal, that the kid is progressing in the gen ed curriculum, they're getting all their special ed services, and that they are participating with non-disabled peers. Meaning, if I'm normally in a situation where I'm in the gen ed class 80% of the day, but you have me in an ISS where I'm only with disabled students, then now I am not participating with non-disabled students. If other students are coming into ISS and I'm with gen ed peers as well, then that would cover that. But you would also have to get, all your services, which again can be really tricky. But I would just encourage you to think about, for those of you who are administrators, is this a situation where I could let the kid go out and get speech? I could let the kid go out and get their pull-out reading services so that they get all those things that they need. And yes, they're coming out of in-school to do that. But I mean, is it a harm to make that happen? Or is it just that we don't normally do that? I mean, try to really think flexibly as much as you can on that. IEP. Okay. IEPs coming to the school past the enrollment date. Man, that is a nightmare. Sometimes we get kids that they've been with us for a month and nobody bothered to tell us, right? Especially when they come from out of state. You just do the best you can. I mean, you try your best to get that information, and then you need to hold a meeting as soon as possible to make that happen. That's not any fault of the school. It's a fault in communication. That's really difficult. More specific in relation to ISS, access to special education or receiving all services such as inclusion. Yes. I think most of the time when you're in middle and high school and you're in mostly in inclusion services, again, if you can provide those services, even though it might be in a special ed or in an in-school setting, but they're there with other students, you could probably make that work. The key is, am I getting the services? Am I getting the instruction and the support that I need? And any services or related services that are on my IEP during the day. If not, then it has to be counted as a day of removal. I think it is probably more difficult to make that happen in middle and high school, except for the fact that in middle and high school, you tend to have more kids actually in school suspension. And so you might be able to do some groups where you're not only supporting that kid, but you're maybe working with a couple of their classmates who are also in there that day. And you might be able to say, you know, does anybody need help with this math assignment? Let's work on this. So that's a possibility too. Okay, just a couple of things for wrap up. Oh, make sure I didn't. Yes, I did get all of those. Okay, so as far as wrap up, I would ask that you each either scan or click on that link and pull down the public essentials for public agency representatives and just complete a very quick evaluation. It's just a few questions. If you've been to any of our trainings before, they're always the same, short and sweet. But I would appreciate the feedback, other than that the chat was disabled, because I got that one and we will fix that one for next time. And then this link on the right is the rest of our trainings that are scheduled until September 30th. After September 30th, we will be on a very different contract, which means we're not sure yet what's going to happen as far as our training offerings. So tap into as much as you can now between now and the end of September. We do know that we will not be providing support about the IEP system, which means that if you have questions about, you know, I can't get this red stop sign to go away, you will actually be contacting PCG or someone at the Department of Education. So things will be changing a little bit, but we do have quite a few trainings between now and the end of September. So I'd invite you to check out any of those. And then if you have any additional questions, please contact me anytime you want. Those of you who already do frequently, a couple of you do, know that I'll try to get back with you as soon as possible on any of this. So I appreciate your time. Please check out the Padlet, and hope everyone has a great school year. And Dr. Winton, I want to say a special hello to you if you're still on here. I appreciate you more than you can know.